A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You will have noticed there are major developments in the Middle East, and you will know if you're a regular listener to this program that when we're talking about it, Christians will be greatly endangered. You may have seen the headlines about the fall of the regime of the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. Rebel forces entered Damascus on the weekend, and Assad and his family have fled to Russia, where they've reportedly been granted asylum. Well, back with a very special guest today, Elizabeth Kendal, who has had a wonderful long career as a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. She has a better take on developments in Syria than anyone I know, and it's always our privilege to welcome back Elizabeth. Elizabeth, great to talk to you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Neil, at this incredibly challenging time.
You know, there's going to be listeners who will agree immediately I say this, that when there's all this talk of the fall of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, celebration of that, but at the hands of a organisation that's recognised broadly as a terror organisation. I wonder if you've got an overall take on what's happened.
Yes, watching the nightly news, it's hard to actually get a grip on what's happening. You hear the language of the rebels and the opposition. You see interviews with Al-Giuliani, the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is being interviewed by CNN like he's, just any old ambassador for a state or something. And it's difficult to really get a grip on what has happened here. Now, I often make the point that the Middle East is not like the West. The Middle East, this is the cradle of civilization. This is an ancient region with ancient peoples, ancient hatreds. And the area that we're thinking of, like if we think of Syria and Iraq, has long been known as the fertile crescent of minorities. So it's been, it's an Arab region, majority Arab and Muslim, but there are little remnants of the indigenous people who are Assyrians, Armenians, Chaldeans, who many say are the same as Assyrians. And in Turkey and Syria, you've also got still remnant Greek populations as well. And they are really like the remnants of a remnant. And when they have had to live under Islam, they have suffered horrendous persecution, massacres, waves of genocidal killings. It's only really been when they've been under secular regimes, even though they've been cruel and dictatorial, but they have created the stability to keep the Islamists at bay. And, I often say there are really only two different types of government in the Middle East, two different types of regime. There's the Islamist regime and there's the anti-Islamist regime. The prisons are always full. If the Islamists are in power, then the prisons will be filled with infidels, with apostates and blasphemers and ethnic and religious minorities. If the secular powers are in power, they have to be really tough to keep a grip on the situation. And the prisons will still be full, but they'll be full of Muslim Brotherhood agitators. They'll be full of Salafi jihadists, people who want to topple the dictator, so they say. But what they want is an Islamist regime. And I tell you what, I'd much rather live under a secular authoritarian than an Islamist regime any day. I mean, what's happened here is the Islamists have taken power, and we're going to end up with a country that's going to look like Libya, I would suggest. It's going to be an absolute catastrophe for hundreds of thousands of remnant Christians in Syria, just like Iraq was.
Worthy of just pausing and reflecting for a moment as you suggest that this is upon us, where those Syrian remnants are now under a greater threat than perhaps ever before because of the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. And it's interesting, isn't it, that here we are saying that I guess we're talking about the best of a bad bunch, but with al-Assad at the helm, there was some level of security for those Syrian-linked Christians.
That's exactly right. So, yeah, as I said, you're either going to have a regime that enforces Islamic law, or you're going to have a regime that keeps the Islamists at bay, keeps them under their foot. You know, they talked the other day, I think it was SBS News, they talked about the toppling of Hafez al-Assad's statue in Hama. And they were saying, look at all the people celebrating the toppling of this statue. They're all so happy and the prisons are being empty. And I thought, you know, they've forgotten that we've seen this movie before. We saw it in Sada City in Baghdad, south of Baghdad, when, you know, the statue of Saddam was toppled and all the Shiites came out into the streets celebrating. And everyone thought, oh, liberation, liberty from the dictator. And it was just the beginning of a massive civil religious war. And the fact of the matter is the people who were celebrating were fundamentalist Muslims and the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood. They mentioned that Hama had been the site of a massacre in the 1980s where Hafez al-Assad cracked down, I think they even said on a pro-democracy rally or something. But what happened in that time, in the 80s, was the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was just after the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood rising in Egypt. There was a great movement of the band Muslim Brotherhood, an uprising in Hama, and Hafez al-Assad said, no, we're not going to have this state, a secular state, run mostly by minorities. We're not going to have it taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood to have an Islamic state. And he met it the way people meet these things in the Middle East. He crushed it. And the people being let out of prison are mostly Islamists. You know, the people who are not celebrating today are Christians and Alawites. Alawites are often known as little Christians because they're more like Christians than they are Muslims, which is why you never see Assad or his wife or children dressed in Islamic garb, or, you know, they're completely westernized. They're like you know, the rulers of Jordan and other countries that are quite very secular and westernized. It's atrocious what's happening. I would think that Christians will be trying to flee as fast as they can today.
All right. So Bashar al-Assad, an Alawite Muslim, but that's a little more secularized, and he was leading a secular state, and there was some level of security there for the Christians that are right across Syria because remnants of ancient Christian civilizations. Let me ask you what you might know about the new rebel leader, Abu Muhammad al-Ghalani, who leads the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, because they're looking like being the new leaders. That's going to be a big threat to Christians.
Well, this is amazing. Now, in my book, After Saturday Comes Sunday, Understanding the Christian Crisis in the Middle East, I look at him in there. I think it might be in the chapter on Iraq, unless it's in the chapter on Syria. But he was a colleague of al-Baghdadi in Iraq, and he was fighting with al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Baghdadi sent him to Syria because he's actually a Syrian native. So Baghdadi sent him to Syria to start up al-Qaeda in Syria, and that's when they created al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq. Now, what happened after that was there was a dispute between various jihadis, and some wanted basically Sharia now. We have to do Allah's will. We have to claim the promises of Allah and do Sharia law right now. And they were what I refer to as the young guns of ISIS. They split away from Al-Qaeda and became ISIS. Al-Qaeda is run by what I call the old guard Islamic fundamentalists, and they actually happen to be highly intelligent. You're looking at Bin Laden was an engineer, and Zawahiri was a pediatrician. These are not silly people. They are mature. They are measured and reasoned in their thinking, very strategic in their thinking, and they had a different policy. And their policy was that you have to be pragmatic. You have to be good to the people who you occupy, because they're going to give you intelligence, and they'll shield you when you need them to shield you. If you go in and you start, killing people for saying stuff, and you start, enacting Sharia on the local population, then they're going to reject you. So they split over this issue. And then the Al-Qaeda group split again. So they decided, Al Giuliani decided that they needed to have a Syrian nationalist Al-Qaeda. So a lot of people were very unhappy with the number of, Chechens and Uyghurs and foreigners who were flowing into the country to fight with Al-Qaeda. So what Al Giuliani suggested was that they needed to be just a Syrian Al-Qaeda group. So they became Jabhat al-Nusra, and then they became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, meaning they're basically just Al-Qaeda in Syria, using Syrian jihadis fighting for the Syrian state. So they're not as interested in the global caliphate and everything, and they don't use international fighters. But, they all have exactly the same agenda.
Same agenda, and you could argue same organisation. And here you have world leaders who are celebrating what was formerly a franchise of Al-Qaeda. They're the people who were responsible for the September 11 attacks on New York. And here are world leaders who are celebrating this outfit with their leader, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There's so much more to say, Elizabeth. Let's make an opportunity to talk some more later this week as things are unfolding, because I sense listeners will want to know the ins and outs of what you understand about Syria and where things are headed in the Middle East. I want to thank you for your update today. I'll push listeners to your website. I'm not sure whether you've got anything up there, because we know you've hung up the gloves a little bit now and you're not in the battle as much. But elizabethkendal.com. Elizabeth mentioned one of her books, After Saturday Comes Sunday, but there's another one called Turn Back the Battle. But you can get those, no doubt, at elizabethkendal.com. Elizabeth, I look forward to another update later this week.
Yes, and pray for the Christians of Syria.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.